The hidden reason no one can invade America. The radar screens light up first, hundreds of small echoes moving fast across the Atlantic. Along the east coast, sirens wail. Within hours, the invaders approach the shoreline. From space, it looks simple, a straight line from Europe to America. But simplicity ends the moment those ships meet what lies beyond the horizon. Supply chains collapse, storms surge, and the first landing crafts never find their way ashore. They thought they were coming for a continent. What they met instead was a continent built for resistance. The United States looks open on a map, vast coastlines, wide gaps between cities, endless plains, but the truth is hidden beneath that sense of openness. Every direction leads to an obstacle: oceans, rivers, mountains, or ice. To understand why no one can truly invade America, you have to see what nature built long before soldiers, tanks, or ships existed. The fortress between two oceans. From space, the continental United States sits like an island between two vast moats, the Atlantic to the east, the Pacific to the west. That geography alone explains more about American security than any modern weapon ever could. Each ocean spans thousands of miles. Each is unpredictable, storm-laden, and logistically unforgiving. For a foreign power, those waters are the first and largest impossible task. Start with the Atlantic. It stretches roughly 4,000 miles between the US East Coast and Western Europe, a gap that swallows fleets. Crossing it requires massive fuel reserves, floating supply lines, and coordination across shifting weather systems. Every kilometer adds risk. Storm tracks sweep from the Caribbean to Newfoundland, forming an unrelenting conveyor belt of turbulent air and rough seas. Naval convoys in both world wars learned this the hard way. Even when the US itself wasn't under threat, Allied crossings demanded staggering resources. Each crossing was a campaign in itself. Now imagine attempting that under fire. Every gallon of fuel, every shell, every day at sea compounds the chances of failure. Modern aircraft and satellites would spot an invasion fleet days before it came close. Refueling ships would become floating targets. And if you somehow managed to reach American waters, you'd still face a coastline that isn't gentle or easy. The eastern seaboard is dotted with barrier islands, shallow estuaries, and tidal flats, terrain that breaks up formations and swallows equipment. Landing thousands of troops, there means gambling everything on beaches that change shape every storm season. Beyond the beaches, the Atlantic states don't open into an easy plain. The coastal lowlands quickly give way to rolling hills, dense forests, and the Appalachian foothills, where vehicles bog down and sightlines vanish. Early European settlers fought the same battle. The landscape itself resisted movement. Geography doesn't need artillery when it can simply slow everything to a crawl. But maybe you think the Pacific offers a better route. It doesn't. If the Atlantic is a moat, the Pacific is a cosmic gulf. From East Asia to California lies nearly 6,000 miles of open water, the largest stretch of navigable ocean on the planet. It's not just distance, it's dynamism. Typhoons, cross-currents, and the largest swells on Earth make sustained operations brutally complex. The Pacific is where logistics go to die. During World War II, American forces faced that same challenge, pushing westward toward Japan. They had the world's most advanced navy and industrial might behind them, yet every island seized came at enormous cost and time. Replace that army with an invader trying to move east toward Los Angeles, with no local supply chain and thousands of miles of ocean behind them, and the math collapses instantly. You'd need floating cities of supply ships and tankers, all vulnerable, all slow, all impossible to replace once hit. People sometimes underestimate what distance really means in warfare. A single transport ship burns through tons of fuel per day. Multiply that by thousands, then factor in escorts, resupply, medical ships, aircraft carriers, and communication networks, all needing constant protection. The longer the supply line, the more of your force is consumed just maintaining itself. By the time you reach the coast, half of your resources are keeping the other half alive. That's why no large-scale invasion has ever succeeded across an ocean without controlling either a nearby staging ground or technology that fundamentally changes mobility. Even D-Day, often romanticized as the ultimate amphibious landing, launched from only 100 miles away with full air cover and local ports. The Atlantic and Pacific multiply that distance to unimaginable scales. The simple act of crossing them magnifies every mistake and magnifies every storm. And there's another layer, the continental shelf. Along much of the US coastline, it drops steeply into deeper waters just offshore, which means natural harbors are limited. You can't just unload an army anywhere you like. The ports that could handle invasion-scale logistics, New York, Savannah, Los Angeles, San Diego, are heavily fortified and surrounded by dense urban environments where any incursion would stall within minutes. For all its affluence, the United States benefits from being geographically inconvenient. It's wealthy yet hard to reach, populous yet separated by immense natural barriers. Nations in Europe or Asia share tight land borders where tank columns can move hundreds of kilometers in days. But America's nearest peer powers are oceans away. The geographic separation gives time for detection, time for mobilization, time for the invaders' morale to erode under endless waves and miles of water. Even extreme hypotheticals, like launching from closer bases in Latin America or the Arctic, face their own maritime nightmares. The Caribbean's narrow channels funnel movement, easy for defenders to monitor. The Aleutians and Bering Strait are frozen, violent corridors where storms descend without warning. Geography keeps every route compromised. Together, the Atlantic and the Pacific form the world's most effective natural perimeter defense, not because they're impossible to cross in theory, but because they're impossible to cross sustainably. An invader can survive a voyage. It cannot survive the endless chain of resupply required afterward. So while satellites and weapons often dominate discussions about national defense, the real secret is still the same as it was centuries ago. America is surrounded by moving walls of water, thousands of miles wide. Even before you reach a single American beach, geography has already chosen the outcome. But oceans are only the first layer. Suppose an invader somehow breaks through, landing on the coast. They'd find that the real battle hasn't even started yet, because immediately inland, another barrier rises from the horizon, silent and immense. The Appalachians wait, the first continental wall in America's interior defense chain. The Appalachian Wall, the Eastern Bastion. From Maine to Alabama, a dark green spine runs down the heart of the eastern United States. These are the Appalachian Mountains, ancient, worn, and deceptive. From a distance, they may look gentle compared to the snow-capped Rockies, but for anyone who's tried to cross them, they're a labyrinth of ridges, hollows, and forests that seem to close in from every side. They may not reach the height of the Himalayas, yet their power isn't measured in altitude, it's measured in obstruction. Over 1,500 kilometers of broken terrain make this range one of the most formidable interior defenses on the continent. An invading force landing anywhere on the eastern seaboard would discover this immediately. The first 100 miles inland are an endless climb, steep ravines, folded hills, and oak-covered ridgelines that grind supply lines and confiscate time. Every contour bleeds momentum. Roads run along narrow valleys where every bend could hide artillery, transforming simple movement into endurance. Satellite maps don't capture how disorienting the Appalachians are once you're inside them. The forest canopy swallows noise and movement, troops vanish, rivers disappear, and machines fade under green ceiling. For defenders familiar with the land, it's a natural ambush corridor that feeds on the impatient. For attackers, it's not just a logistical trap, it's a landscape built to consume the unprepared, 1 mile at a time. History proved it long before modern war existed. In the 18th century, European settlers pushing west called the Appalachians the Great Barrier. Marching armies struggled here just as much as wagon trains and traders. In 1755, a British expedition under General Edward Braddock attempted to push through the mountains toward the Ohio Valley. His men had to build a new road 12 feet wide just to drag their supply wagons over the ridges. It took months, and by the time the road was complete, his army was exhausted and undersupplied. They were defeated before reaching their destination. Geography, more than muskets, broke that campaign. The lesson repeated itself during the American Civil War. The Appalachians divided the conflict's entire strategic map. For the Union, forcing troops through the Blue Ridge or Cumberland Mountains was painfully slow, each pass easily defended, every ridge a ready-made fort. In 1862, Confederate Commander Stonewall Jackson used the Shenandoah Valley, one of the few navigable corridors through the range, to outmaneuver much larger Union forces. With only 17,000 men, he marched more than 600 miles, using the terrain as both shield and highway. Larger armies chased him, but could never trap him. His movement showed exactly why mountain terrain favors the smaller, more agile defender. If war ever reached American soil again, the Appalachian chain would play the same role. Imagine an enemy trying to move mechanized columns west from the Atlantic coast. The mountains slice every route into narrow strands, Interstate 64 across Virginia, Interstate 40 through Tennessee, or tiny state roads snaking through the Carolinas. A single demolished bridge or landslide could stop a column for days. There's no combining of forces once inside. Every valley becomes its own battlefield, isolated, self-contained. A defending army could withdraw deeper, reappear elsewhere, and never lose its mobility advantage. Even in peacetime, the region reminds planners how relentless it can be. Freight trains must double their engines to climb grades of only 2%. Highways twist like ribbons because straight lines are impossible. Helicopters encounter sudden fog and crosswinds generated by overlapping ridges. In winter, the same slopes that slow trucks turn into ice chutes. Any invasion relying on heavy logistics, fuel convoys, ammunition trucks, field hospitals, would find every mile here to be an engineering problem. Another invisible obstacle is the forest itself. Over 90% of the central and southern Appalachians are wooded. A force trying to operate inside them would struggle with drone visibility, GPS reliability, and power generation under thick canopy. There's a reason guerrilla warfare thrives in such conditions. A defender who knows the trails, ridgelines, and hidden hollows could outlast any technologically superior invader. It's terrain built for attrition, not for blitzkrieg. Settlers once saw the Appalachians as a frontier wall separating the known world from the wilderness beyond. That impression still matters strategically. West of the crest line lies the deep interior of the United States, the Ohio Valley, the Central Plains, and eventually the Mississippi Basin. Control of the Appalachians determines who can reach that heartland. During every major conflict in American history, armies that held these passes controlled supply routes to the interior. Jackson's Valley Campaign demonstrated that a few thousand troops using local knowledge could tie down whole divisions simply by exploiting topography. That imbalance has never changed. From a geological perspective, the range is one of Earth's oldest. Its mountains are not towering like the Alps because they've been eroded for hundreds of millions of years, leaving dense, uneven folds rather than peaks. That erosion created exactly the kind of complexity modern armies hate: endless micro-valleys, ridges that run in odd directions, watercourses that vanish underground. For armored formations or large convoys, there's no rhythm to the land, no straight thrust possible, only constant detours. Every detour burns fuel and time. Even air power doesn't erase the advantage of terrain. Radar is disrupted by the ridgelines. Low-altitude flight paths become hazardous due to unpredictable thermals and visibility gaps. Transport aircraft require flat space to land, and those are scarce inside the range. You can bomb the surface, but you can't occupy it effectively. To hold territory, you need movement, and the Appalachians simply don't permit smooth movement. One of the most telling modern examples isn't from war at all, but from infrastructure. The construction of the Appalachian Development Highway System in the late 20th century took decades longer and billions more dollars than planners expected. Entire mountain faces had to be carved or tunneled to connect towns only a few dozen miles apart. Those same constraints would confront any invader. For defenders, though, it means natural containment. There are only a handful of predictable crossing routes worth guarding, and those can be hardened easily. Think of it as a filter. The Appalachians don't stop an army absolutely, but they strip it of its cohesion and speed. Every unit that enters emerges slower, smaller, and more exposed than when it went in. By the time an invader's spearhead clears the mountains, It no longer resembles a spear. It's scattered shards of a force that can be isolated and destroyed piecemeal. This is what geographers call a defense in depth, created naturally, not by design. And beyond the military analysis, there's the psychological factor. Troops advancing through mountains rarely know where they are or what lies ahead. Maps don't match the folded reality underfoot. Morale fades when every turn looks the same and every radio crackles with interference. For defenders, the inverse is true. The land feels familiar, intimate, even protective. That's why terrain isn't just a physical barrier, it's an emotional one. So if the oceans are America's outer moat, the Appalachians are its inner wall, a living fortress of stone and forest that has tested every generation of people who tried to master it. Behind this wall stretches the continental heartland, but no army reaches it easily. Beyond these ridges waits the wide Mississippi Basin, a landscape vast enough to swallow entire invasions whole. To enter that heart, an enemy would have to cross the longest river system on the continent, where every crossing is exposed and every bridge a choke point. The next barrier of America's defense is not made of stone, but of moving water, the Mississippi Divide. The Mississippi Divide, the impassable artery. When an invading army finally pushes past the Appalachians, tired, undersupplied, and stretched thin, it meets the most decisive obstacle on the continent. The Mississippi River, 2,300 miles of moving water that divides the United States like a liquid wall. It drains 40% of the nation and links 31 states, running from the frozen lakes of Minnesota to the swamps of Louisiana. To the casual observer, it's just a river. To a strategist, it's an impassable artery that separates east from west and turns geography itself into defense. Every major power that's fought on this continent has understood the river's power. For centuries, control of the Mississippi meant control of America. Its bends, tributaries, and floodplains form a network so vast that you can travel from the Alleghenies to the Rockies by water. The system includes the Ohio, Missouri, Tennessee, and Arkansas rivers, all natural highways that serve defenders far better than attackers. Because the flow moves south, any army advancing west or east must defy the current, crossing unpredictable channels hundreds of meters wide and loaded with silt, sandbars, and shifting islands. In peacetime, it's an economic superhighway, carrying more than 400 million tons of cargo each year. In war, that same infrastructure transforms into a barrier laced with defensive advantages. The bridges, spaced as much as 150 kilometers apart, become critical choke points. Destroy one, and an army's route vanishes. Even temporary pontoon crossings are dangerous. Strong undercurrents can tear them apart in hours. Flood season makes it worse. From March through June, the river can swell dozens of feet, turning entire counties into marsh. An invader can't simply cross during favorable weather because floods rewrite the terrain. A map drawn 1 month earlier becomes useless the next. The Civil War revealed the river's true strategic magnitude. In the 186s, when the United States fought itself, the Mississippi became the dividing line of victory and defeat. General Ulysses Grant understood that taking the river would slice the Confederacy in half. His siege of Vicksburg lasted 47 days, with armies contending not only with gunfire, but with the geography, heat, swamps, mosquitoes, and a river that changed course overnight. When Vicksburg fell in July 1863, the Confederacy's western armies were cut off. From that point forward, the South fought in fragments, its supply lines split by water. Geography, not ideology, determined the turning point of the war. That same lesson holds in a modern context. Suppose an invading coalition manages to secure parts of the eastern United States. Tank divisions move westward through Tennessee and Arkansas, trying to press toward the Great Plains. The Mississippi stands in the way. Crossing such a river under fire means assembling hundreds of boats and bridging units while exposed to drones, aircraft, and shore batteries. Every crossing becomes a death trap. Defenders on the western bank can concentrate fire on predictable crossing points, while upstream dams can manipulate flow rates, raising water levels to destroy temporary spans. Nature itself becomes a weapon. There's also the sheer width. Near St. Louis or Memphis, the Mississippi can exceed a mile across. Surface currents move at 5 knots, fast enough to destabilize barges or roll over amphibious vehicles. Beneath that calm-looking surface lurk whirlpools and sheer flows strong enough to drag tanks into the mud. Even modern engineering can't change the physics of thousands of cubic meters per second pouring southward. When logistically fragile armies depend on exact timing, a current like that ruins coordination instantly. And the obstacles aren't confined to the main channel. The river's floodplain stretches 10 to 15 miles on either side in many regions, made of soft alluvial soil. Heavy armor can sink up to its chassis after minor rainfall. Roads frequently sit atop raised levees, thin strips of dry ground susceptible to artillery fire. If destroyed, they funnel traffic into bottlenecks or straight into swamps. Satellite reconnaissance shows there are only a few dozen practical crossings for heavy vehicles between Cairo, Illinois, and Baton Rouge, Louisiana. Any invader forced through those limited corridors becomes predictable long before reaching them. Defenders, on the other hand, can use the river as reinforcement speedway. Barges, tugboats, and even civilian vessels can ferry supplies north and south within secure interior lines. During natural disasters, the same network moves tens of thousands of tons of equipment in days, a mobility no attacker could match from offshore. It's not just that the river divides, it connects everything on the defender's side. The psychology of the river also matters. Armies moving west must cross it at the height of exhaustion. They've already spent their reserves fighting terrain and distance. What they see instead of open plains is a restless expanse of brown water stretching to the horizon, hemmed by forests and industrial silhouettes. It's not a frontier inviting passage, but one warning them that every movement forward drains supplies faster. Even the sound of the river, a constant, rushing thunder, reminds soldiers of vulnerability. To cross is to gamble the whole campaign on a few fragile bridges. Consider the infrastructure itself. The Mississippi supports more than 60 major bridges, each a masterpiece of engineering and each a potential catastrophe if lost. Destroy a single key crossing upstream and downstream navigation suffers for weeks. For defenders, this redundancy is strength. For invaders, it's nightmare math. They can't rebuild what was designed for century-scale loads under fire. And even if they captured a bridge intact, its approaches could be mined or flooded within hours. Further complicating any invasion is the river's integration into America's inland waterway system. From the Mississippi, barges can access the Ohio and the Tennessee-Tombigbee waterway, connecting deep into the interior. These links form what strategists call interior lines, routes that allow rapid redeployment. During conflict, that system effectively doubles as a defensive logistics grid under the Army Corps of Engineers and Coast Guard oversight, capable of rerouting materials and personnel across a continent without touching a single highway. No foreign army could replicate or disrupt that without occupying an area larger than Western Europe. Even the terrain adjacent to the Mississippi favors defense. To the east, rolling bluffs offer commanding views over the floodplain. To the west, the delta sprawls into labyrinthine bayous and wetlands where mechanized vehicles are useless. Defensive positions can fire across open water or retreat into endless lowlands. Every attempt to find dry ground leads to unpredictability, a landscape that shifts with every season, favoring whoever knows its cycles. The air environment adds another layer of resistance. The river valley generates its own weather, thick fogs at dawn, violent thunderstorms in spring, and crosswinds severe enough to ground aircraft. Radar clutter from moisture and terrain masking complicates targeting for precision strikes. Any invasion relying on air dominance would see that advantage eroded. The combination of climate, hydrology, and turbulence makes coordination more complex than any battle manual anticipates. Strategically, the Mississippi defines not just geography but identity. It's the seam between regions, the cultural divide between east and west, south and north. Even if an invader occupied one bank, they'd face an entirely different logistical, cultural, and defensive environment on the other. Holding both sides simultaneously would require twice the manpower, double the fuel, and an impossible tempo of resupply. Empires have crumbled trying less. To see its full scale, trace its watershed on a map. It forms a tree whose branches stretch from Montana to Pennsylvania. Every raindrop falling in that enormous territory eventually feeds into the main artery. For defenders, that means every tributary is a highway flowing homeward. For attackers, it's countless smaller rivers to cross before even reaching the main one. An invader would have to rebuild civilization with every mile, bridging, dredging, and maintaining supply across terrain designed to confound them. So when analysts describe the Mississippi as America's spine, they're not speaking metaphorically. It carries the lifeblood of commerce, but in military terms, it's the nation's circulatory shield. Crossing it without consent would take not only immense resources, but defiance of hydrology, infrastructure, and history itself. Every empire that tried to control such rivers, from the Danube to the Volga, eventually learned that water wins wars by waiting. The Mississippi doesn't need fortresses or troops. Its current alone defends a continent. The Rockies, the interior ramparts. By the time an invading army approaches the central plains from the east, it's already endured distances that exhaust even well-planned campaigns. But ahead rises a horizon line unlike any other in North America, a rampart of stone and weather nearly 300 miles wide. The Rocky Mountains. They're not a single chain, but an interlocking system of ranges, valleys, and plateaus stretching from New Mexico all the way to the Canadian Arctic. Together, they form a natural barricade that divides the continent's climate, rivers, and people. Every would-be conqueror must either go around them or perish trying to go through them. At first glance, it might seem possible to cross by following established routes, Interstate 70 through Colorado, 80 through Wyoming, or 90 across Montana. But those corridors tell only half the story. Each highway represents decades of engineering, thousands of tons of concrete, and constant maintenance just to keep them open for civilian traffic. Even in peacetime, rockslides close them for days. In winter, avalanches sweep them away entirely. For an army trying to move tanks and artillery, the logistical strain would be catastrophic. Every turn hides a potential choke point where one destroyed viaduct or tunnel collapse can block progress for weeks. The Rockies don't resist invasion merely with height. They resist with complexity. Peaks exceed 14,000 feet, valleys plunge thousands below, and between them lie arid basins that look deceptively passable until vehicles sink in dust or snow. The elevation difference alone creates microclimates, a sunny slope on one side, a blizzard on the other. Aircraft attempting to support ground forces must contend with turbulence from steep gradients and unpredictable updrafts that can stall engines. Communications fail as radio signals scatter along irregular granite walls. Geography here doesn't just slow progress, it kills coordination. During the 19th century, even those migrating voluntarily struggled. Wagon trains attempting to cross the Central Mountain Corridor followed narrow passes like South Pass in Wyoming or Raton Pass between Colorado and New Mexico. These routes were painstakingly scouted because everything else was impassable. Early explorers described weeks spent searching for routes only to face impassable walls of snow. If lightly equipped pioneers struggled to bring families across, mechanized armies with fuel-hungry machines would face a problem on an entirely different scale. Fuel convoys would burn more energy climbing grades than moving forward. Every gallon consumed before battle even begins is victory handed to whoever defends the western side. For defenders, the Rockies offer perfect topography. Ridgetops dominate valleys so completely that observation posts can monitor hundreds of miles. Few other landscapes in the world provide such consistent elevation advantage. One look at the continental divide, the line separating rivers that flow to the Pacific from those that flow to the Atlantic, reveals why it's also a fortress line. Most passes across that divide sit above 10,000 feet. Keeping them supplied in warm weather requires oxygen support and snow clearing every few hours. In cold months, they close entirely, sealing the barrier like a drawbridge pulled up. Air power can't fully neutralize this obstacle. Thin air at altitude reduces helicopter lift, limiting payload and maneuverability. Jet engines lose thrust where oxygen density drops, meaning shorter range and reduced climb rates. Aerial refueling becomes dangerous amid mountain turbulence. For reconnaissance drones, heavy winds and narrow valleys cripple endurance. The mountains themselves scramble radar returns, producing ghost signals and false positives. For defenders stationed within the high valleys, hiding becomes almost effortless. For attackers, locating anything becomes guesswork. The weather enforces its own military doctrine. Snow can arrive in mid-September and linger through May. Temperatures swing from scorching days to sub-zero nights, cracking tires, freezing hydraulics, and draining batteries. Roads that look clear in sunlight transform into sheets of black ice an hour later. Fuel lines congeal, electronics malfunction, soldiers lose mobility simply trying to breathe in thin air. Even modern armies trained for alpine warfare maintain only small specialized units for those conditions, not millions of troops. Sustaining a continental invasion through them would require turning the entire supply structure into a mountain expedition. There are corridors where crossing seems deceptively feasible, the Platte Valley leading toward Denver or the Arkansas through southern Colorado. Historically, those gaps became lifelines of westward expansion, then arteries of commerce. But every corridor is a funnel, easy to predict and easier to defend. A series of well-placed demolitions can block one for months. Bridges spanning narrow canyons become perfect traps, destroy them, and the terrain offers no alternative side route. Defenders need only retreat higher, while gravity and weather do the rest. Another factor lies beneath the surface: scarcity of water. East of the range, rivers widen and nourish farmland. West of it, they vanish into desert. An invading force attempting to descend the western slope instantly meets a new logistical desert. Few settlements, fewer lakes, and even fewer supply points mean that the farther you advance, the more dependent you become on the infrastructure you don't control. Every mile deeper westward lengthens the supply line into a lifeless world of sagebrush and rock terrain, where every drop of fuel or water must be imported. Defenders, by contrast, fight close to known aquifers and established logistics hubs along the Front Range cities: Denver, Colorado Springs, Cheyenne, locations already adapted to altitude and isolation. Strategically, the Rockies act as both barrier and amplifier. They protect what lies behind them: the highly productive basins of Utah, Nevada, Idaho, and the Pacific coast beyond. During an invasion, that means any eastern advance slows to attrition before even threatening California or Oregon. Defenders can use interior rail networks through low passes to shuttle reinforcements north or south faster than attackers can climb 5 miles of elevation. Furthermore, natural gas and mineral wealth embedded in these mountains give defenders a local resource surge: fuel, metals, and fortified shelter inside tunnels or mines. For an invader, even capturing a valley provides no triumph. It's another cul-de-sac surrounded by high ground. Historically, the Rockies ensured that America developed as two interdependent halves rather than one vulnerable bloc. During the Civil War, Confederate forces trying to push into Union-held Colorado struggled not against armies but terrain. Later, in World War II, the U.S. Army studied potential invasion routes through North America and noted that the Rockies would force any foreign power landing on one coast to halt before ever reaching the interior. Geography alone guaranteed time for mobilization. In modern defense planning, that remains true. Satellite early warning combined with impassable terrain means an invading column couldn't move 50 miles west of the plains before detection. The Rockies also introduce economic physics impossible to ignore. Every convoy climbing from the Great Plains near Denver gains nearly a mile in altitude across just 70 miles of horizontal distance. That rise burns fuel exponentially. Heavy lift vehicles lose efficiency, and braking systems overheat descending on the other side. Civilian logistics manage it by constant maintenance. Wartime logistics couldn't spare that luxury. For each tank or truck that breaks down, replacement parts must travel the same route again, doubling the strain. So the mountain range doesn't need active resistance to win. It wins by economics of effort. Even if an invader somehow crests the continental divide, they face the western slope, steeper, drier, and sharper. From the summit line to the basin of Utah or Nevada, terrain alternates between disconnected valleys surrounded by mountains higher than their eastern counterparts. Crossing them requires ascending and descending repeatedly, compounding fatigue. Every descent consumes brakes, every climb consumes engines, and the air thickens with dust that fouls machinery. The pattern repeats for hundreds of miles. The Rockies don't end, they dissolve gradually into deserts that extend the hardship indefinitely. Consider also altitude sickness. Human physiology begins to degrade above 8,000 feet without adaptation. Fatigue, nausea, and slowed reaction times hit troops after days at those elevations. Civilian mountaineers plan weeks to acclimate. An invading force doesn't have that luxury. It fights against nature's own timer. Armies trained at sea level would find themselves gasping before facing a single defender. All of this converges into a simple truth. Even if the Rockies aren't an impregnable wall in a literal sense, they function as one in every practical measure: distance, effort, time, and morale. The mountains stretch the cost of every mile until conquest becomes self-defeating. Each pass conquered leaves an army smaller, hungrier, and slower than before. Defenders only have to wait downhill. Yet even before an attacker reaches these heights, another landscape warns of what's coming: a northern expanse where cold and scale accomplish what cliffs and avalanches do here. Beyond the Rockies lies a different kind of fortress: ice, water, and air-bound cold forming the next barrier in the continental chain, the defensive shield of the Great Lakes and the Arctic frontier. The Great Lakes Shield. To the north, where forest meets freshwater, another layer of natural defense rises, not in mountains or rivers this time, but in inland seas. The Great Lakes form the largest continuous body of freshwater on Earth, holding nearly 20% of the planet's supply. Together, Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, and Ontario, they stretch more than 700 miles from Minnesota to New York, a sequence of vast water barriers large enough to hide cities on the horizon. For an invader approaching from Canada or the North Atlantic, this region isn't a gateway. It's a labyrinth that turns navigation into attrition and strategy into guesswork. At first glance, the lakes might seem like opportunities, broad surfaces to move ships, troop carriers, or supply barges. But scale deceives. Each lake behaves more like an inland ocean than a navigable river. Lake Superior alone could swallow all of New England's coastline inside its perimeter, and waves there routinely reach 20 feet in storm season. Winter locks much of the system under thick ice for months, sealing ports and freezing vessels in place. Strategic mobility disappears right when it would be needed most. Historically, the Great Lakes Corridor has always dictated how wars could or couldn't be fought in North America. During the War of 1812, both American and British Canadian forces built fleets on Lakes Erie and Ontario, but logistics strangled both sides. Ships had to be constructed locally because transporting materials overland was slow and costly. Many campaigns stalled for seasons waiting on lumber, iron, or crew. Even then, the winner of each naval clash gained only temporary advantage. Storms or distance erased it in weeks. Any modern power facing those same physical realities would suffer the same fate. For defenders, the lakes are natural fortifications wrapping around the upper Midwest. They bound Michigan on three sides, isolate Chicago behind inland waters, and force any assault from Canada to funnel through narrow straits: Detroit River, Lake St. Clair, the Straits of Mackinac, and the Niagara Corridor. Each crossing is predictable, chokeable, and heavily urbanized, ideal for defense. Destroy a single bridge or port facility, and entire supply chains collapse. Unlike rivers, these passages can't easily be bridged. Their width and depth require full-scale engineering projects, not temporary spans. Consider the distances involved. From the western tip of Lake Superior to the mouth of the St. Lawrence River lies more than 2,000 miles of connected waterways. Moving a convoy across requires coordinating locks, canals, and inland routes that freeze, flood, or narrow seasonally. The St. Lawrence Seaway, the only outlet to the Atlantic, is 9 months navigable at best and is easily blockaded at its chokepoints near Montreal or Quebec City. A hostile fleet would have to travel through foreign, heavily monitored waters long before entering the continental interior. For defenders, merely controlling those chokepoints ensures that no armada can slip quietly toward the Midwest. Even assuming an invader somehow reached the Great Lakes, weather turns against them. Rapid shifts in temperature between air and water generate dense fog near shorelines. Autumn gales arrive with almost rhythmic brutality. Mariners refer to Superior's November when entire freighters vanish in squalls. These storms arise because the lakes collect immense heat during summer and release it violently in cooler months. Radar interference, low visibility navigation, and unpredictable wind shear make air or naval coordination chaotic. Every weapons system, depending on precision, becomes useless when nature scrambles the sensors. Defensive logistics, by contrast, thrive here. The United States and Canada maintain a dense network of ports, shipyards, and power grids along the southern shores. Cities like Duluth, Milwaukee, Detroit, Cleveland, and Buffalo already operate as integrated industrial nodes. In wartime, they transform into inland fortresses supported by plenty of freshwater, fuel routes, and manufacturing capacity. Inland shipbuilding is shielded from ocean attack, yet retains access through the St. Lawrence Corridor when needed. This is why early 20th century planners referred to the region as the Arsenal Lake Belt. No foreign invasion could seize those resources without first surviving the weather and distance that isolate them. The Great Lakes also double as surveillance zones. Their open waters create perfect radar and sonar fields. Any unusual movement stands out immediately against the flat horizon. Combined with satellite tracking, defenders could monitor every vessel from entry to exit. An attacker can hide among archipelagos or fjords. On the lakes, there's nowhere to vanish. Even submarines are useless. Depths reach a maximum of 1,300 feet, far too shallow for stealth operations compared to oceanic trenches. Any attempt to submerge would be detected by acoustic arrays that already monitor for earthquakes and ship traffic. On land, the surrounding terrain compounds the defense. The northern shores are lined with rocky shield formations, ancient granite ridges left by glaciers, while the southern edges descend into soft moraines and wetlands. Heavy vehicles bog down quickly, and road networks thin out between forested peninsulas. There are few points of entry for large mechanized forces. Any invading army moving south from Ontario would have to cross from Windsor to Detroit or from Fort Erie to Buffalo, two corridors lined with millions of residents and defensive infrastructure. It's urban combat by necessity, not choice. The terrain does not offer clean thrusts. Energy and environment reinforce that isolation. Hydroelectric dams built along the Niagara and the St. Mary's rivers control both power generation and water flow. In a crisis, those structures could be operated to flood low canals, block locks, or deny passage altogether. For the invader, every logistical assumption becomes uncertain. For defenders, geography becomes an adjustable weapon. Icebreakers, lock systems, and dam schedules effectively decide when and where movement is even possible. Climate change introduces only more unpredictability. Variable ice cover, fluctuating water levels, and stronger storms multiply the uncertainty any attacker would face. Even modern simulation models struggle to predict the lake's seasonal patterns. That volatility grants natural advantage to those stationed permanently nearby naval, coast guard, and civilian authorities that understand the rhythms of storms and seasons. An invading commander, operating from foreign data, would make wrong assumptions about navigation windows and find whole fleets stuck in harbors or stranded mid-channel when freezing returns early. And there's another, rarely mentioned consequence. The Great Lakes divide industrial concentration. East of them lies the Mid-Atlantic Corridor, west of them, the agricultural core of America. To control supply across that divide, an enemy would need ownership of the bridges, tunnels, and locks spanning it. Those are limited in number: the Blue Water Bridge at Port Huron, the Ambassador Bridge at Detroit, and a handful of tunnels under the Detroit and St. Clair rivers. Each is simple to disable, yet immense to rebuild. Cutting them severs logistical arteries within days. What was meant to unify becomes an insurmountable split. Psychologically, the lakes reinforce a defensive mindset. For over 2 centuries, their vastness has made the northern border one of the quietest in the world. Military planners treat it almost like an ocean boundary because that's how it behaves. Winds pile up water as seiches, miniature tides several feet high that can swallow docks overnight. Fog rolls in so thick that even locals lose their bearings. Every attempt to move an army across such terrain risks drowning before fighting. It's not that soldiers can't cross water, It's that the water itself decides when to allow passage. For modern defense, this northern shield integrates perfectly with technology. Satellite-guided vessels rely on the automatic identification system managing traffic on every lake. Any vessel deactivating signals stands out immediately. Surveillance drones can launch from dozens of existing airfields around the basin. There's no approach undetected, no element of surprise. Geography assists electronics by simplifying where threats can appear, only along finite corridors that sensors already dominate. Ultimately, the Great Lakes create a paradox. They appear to divide the continent, but for defense they unite it, tying Midwestern cities into one continuous bastion unreachable from outside. Together, with the Mississippi on one flank and the Rockies beyond, they complete the triad of America's internal fortress. For an invader imagining the northern border as the easiest route, the reality is harsher, cold water deeper than skyscrapers, weather that punishes precision, and shorelines that offer no quiet landing. From a military geographer's view, this is the final inland moat before the open plains. To the south and west stretches flat land that seems welcoming, but history and physics whisper the same warning. The ground ahead might look simple, yet it can betray you faster than mountains or rivers ever could. The Great Plains and the illusion of easy ground. After mountains and lakes, the next landscape seems almost merciful. Stretching from Texas to the Dakotas, the Great Plains look like an open door, flat, endless, and free of obvious obstacles. To an invader struggling through rivers and forests, this horizon must appear as relief, but that impression is the final deception. The Great Plains are not a battlefield of opportunity, they are a desert of exposure, a place where distance itself becomes the enemy. Armies disappear here not because of resistance, but because there is nowhere to hide from sight, weather, or exhaustion. From above, the plains form a single tilted table, rising gently from east to west for nearly 1,000 miles. The slope seems harmless, a gradient of barely 1 foot every 1,000, but over those miles, it lifts everything toward high altitude. Air grows thinner, moisture fades, and vegetation struggles. Travelers in the 19th century called it the Great American Desert. They weren't far wrong. Without the irrigation networks built over the past century, much of it would still be too dry for sustained life. For an army relying on water, fuel, and cover, that scarcity defines the campaign before it even begins. Night and day on the plains are extremes. Summers bring heat that warps metal and dries rivers to dust. Winters drop temperatures dozens of degrees below zero with wind speeds strong enough to bury vehicles under drifts overnight. The openness amplifies everything, cold moves faster, storms grow larger, and dust follows any disturbance. Thunderstorms can stretch from horizon to horizon, spawning tornadoes powerful enough to scatter convoys. Even modern infrastructure struggles. Highways close every season because snow turns visibility to zero. The same conditions that challenge civilians would immobilize mechanized armies. Then comes the psychological toll. On the plains, distances deceive perception. What looks 10 miles away might be 50. Without forests or mountains for reference, soldiers lose sense of scale. Marching feels endless. Supply convoys underestimate travel times and fuel needs because the land plays optical tricks. Aerial reconnaissance offers little help. The uniformity of the terrain hides movement not through concealment, but through repetition. Everything looks the same. For coordination, that's a nightmare. Units drift apart, navigation errors multiply, and resupply points become mirages on maps more than ground reality. Strategically, the isolation of the plains transforms logistics from complex to impossible. Every gallon of fuel, every ounce of food must cross hundreds of miles of sparsely populated land. Rail lines, pipelines, and highways follow fixed corridors, easy for defenders to monitor or destroy. Blow one bridge over the Arkansas or Platte rivers, and you sever routes for hundreds of miles. Unlike Europe, where dense networks allow rerouting, the American interior has vast stretches where single tracks or highways handle nearly all heavy transport. An invader here fights a war of one-lane supply lines. Defenders, though, hold the opposite advantage. From the Rockies to the Mississippi, This region is threaded with infrastructure built to move grain, oil, and equipment. In war, every silo, well, and rail yard becomes a logistics station. Local forces could operate with near-infinite resupply drawn from the continent's own abundance. America's agricultural and energy heart lies here, fields that feed cities, wells that fuel industries, and factories capable of rebuilding fleets. An invading force would never be able to cut all those veins simultaneously. Each strike healed itself through redundancies the size of entire states. The openness also favors modern surveillance. On the plains, there's nowhere to hide from satellites, radar, or drone patrols. The curvature of the Earth becomes the only cover. Heat signatures stand out against flat ground. Movement forms perfect contrasts for sensors designed to detect change. Every conv, every tank, every truck becomes a flashing signal from hundreds of miles away. For a defender equipped with aerial observation, the plains are a hunter's field, a space where invisibility is impossible and advance means exposure. Even communication betrays the attacker. Radio waves travel far over open ground, but with no natural shielding. That means transmissions reveal positions instantly. The same vastness that tempts invasion provides defenders early warning. By the time an enemy unit crosses Kansas or Nebraska, satellites and radar would have plotted its path for days. Interception isn't just likely, it's automatic. Weather remains the most uncontrollable variable. The Great Plains create their own climate engine. Warm air from the Gulf collides with Arctic fronts and dry air dropping down from the Rockies, producing thunderstorms of continental scale. Lightning storms knock out electronics, floods wash out rail tracks, and winds flip entire trailers. Pilots call it the most unpredictable airspace in North America. For an invader stretched thin across open ground, every storm delays supply and isolates columns. Nature operates as a rolling blockade. Historically, this region has punished movement. During the Dust Bowl of the 193s, winds carried topsail thousands of miles, turning the sky black and burying farms. If environmental conditions alone could displace millions of residents, imagine armored vehicles attempting prolonged occupation under similar cycles. Grassfires driven by 40-mile-per-hour winds can travel faster than tanks. Rainfall turns dirt roads into slurry pits. For any army not native to this environment, survival consumes as much effort as combat. Human geography compounds these obstacles. Towns are separated by tens of miles, cities by hundreds. Each community controls vital resources, fuel depots, rail junctions, highways that form natural defensive nodes. Destroy one, fall back to the next, and the enemy gains nothing but empty space. That's the essence of elastic defense. The larger the invader's front stretches, the weaker it becomes. The U.S. interior was effectively engineered through geography and settlement patterns to make sustained occupations suicidal. And there's the wind, a force often ignored in strategy. Across the plains, average year-round winds reach 15 to 20 miles per hour and can double without warning. Such constant motion limits use of aircraft, drones, and even artillery accuracy. Precision systems calibrated for stable air find themselves operating in turbulence that shifts second by second. Dust storms clog filters, obscure optics, and grind moving parts with fine grit. The land itself attacks machinery just by existing. In modern defense planning, the plains' openness becomes an ally for air power. Bases scattered from Oklahoma to North Dakota can project coverage over every approach corridor. Aircraft launching from the center of the country can reach either coast in hours, guided by radar networks unobstructed by terrain. No invading force could advance without constant exposure to air assault. Ground occupation would turn into a moving target range visible from orbit. Economically, the scale of the plains ensures endurance. Beneath those fields lie aquifers, oil shale, and gas deposits, resources a defender can exploit while under siege. For an invader, those same resources remain unreachable without complete territorial control, which the geography denies. You can conquer a city, you can't control 1,200 miles of exposure. Even if an enemy captured key hubs like Wichita or Omaha, their gains would mean little. Surrounding land offers no natural barriers to defend positions, only endless open approaches. Every occupation zone becomes a circle vulnerable from all directions, requiring constant patrol and impossible manpower. Historically, flat terrains invite mobility warfare, but only if both sides are evenly supplied. Here, one side has local infrastructure that loops endlessly, the other stretches a single thread back across the ocean. Ultimately, the Great Plains illustrate warfare's cruel paradox. Terrain that looks easiest to cross often proves hardest to hold. The same emptiness that promises speed demands infinite fuel, infinite vigilance, and shelters none from the sky. Invaders here would fight not against armies, but against distance, wind, and hunger. For defenders, it's the breathing space between natural fortresses, the land where time and visibility fight on their side. And beyond this apparent openness, another trial begins. As the plains descend toward the southwest, flatness gives way to heat, rock, and desolation, the deserts of Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. What seemed endless becomes constricted again. The southwestern Gauntlet. Move south from the plains and the ground begins to twist upward again. Trees fade, grass turns brittle, and colors shift from green to gold and red. This is the southwestern United States, an expanse of desert, canyon, and heat stretching from West Texas to Nevada. To an invading force, it looks deceptively navigable from the air, wide basins, straight highways, and clear skies. But on the ground, every mile becomes punishment. The region is less a landscape than a test of endurance, a gauntlet fashioned by sun, stone, and scarcity. Start in Texas, near the Rio Grande. The river defines the border for 1,200 miles, winding through cliffs and canyons like a moat of shifting mud. Its channels change yearly, carving new sandbars and cutting off old ones. Crossing points are few. In places like Big Bend or the lower reaches near Brownsville, the banks alternate between sheer walls and marsh, making large-scale movement nearly impossible without advanced engineering. During dry months, there's hardly enough water to drink. After storms, flash floods appear without notice, erasing roads in hours. Any army dependent on mechanical timing would find all forecasts worthless. Once past the river, the temperature becomes the next enemy. Summer highs exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit across southern Arizona and western Texas. Asphalt warps, ammunition cooks off, tires melt, and human stamina collapses in hours. Shade is rare, water rarer. Supply trucks must carry every drop of coolant, fuel, and drinking water in convoys vulnerable to simple disruption. Destroy a handful of tankers, and entire battalions stall. For defenders already stationed in military bases near El Paso, Tucson, or Yuma, that vulnerability creates an obvious tactic. Let nature accelerate attrition. Wait, watch, and strike when dehydration and machinery have done the work. The terrain dictates isolation. Between settlements stretch hundreds of miles of nothing, scrubland, basalt ridges, and dry washes that disguise their depth until the first vehicle sinks into them. Roads and railways thread narrow passes like veins, shut one, and a region becomes unreachable. That's why southwestern infrastructure clusters along predictable corridors. Interstate 10 from San Antonio to Los Angeles, I-40 through Albuquerque and Flagstaff, I-8 near the border. These are lifelines, not options. Their vulnerability is enormous. Blowing a bridge in New Mexico or collapsing a single canyon pass could sever east-west movement entirely. There's simply no alternate path short of hundreds of miles of detour through mountains or reservation land. Elevation adds another layer of punishment. Within short distances, altitude jumps from near sea level to over 7,000 feet, forcing engines and lungs to fluctuate between dense and thin air. Aircraft lose lift, ground troops lose endurance. Desert mornings begin barely above freezing, yet afternoons can reach lethal temperatures. Equipment tuned for one extreme fails in the other. Combat readiness becomes a variable, not a given. Strategically, the desert seems to invite armored warfare. Long sightlines and open ground promise speed. Historically, though deserts rarely favor the attacker, the North African campaigns of the 194s proved that heat, wind, and fuel scarcity matter more than maneuver. The Southwest magnifies those conditions. An invader attempting to roll westward would have to replicate Rommel's logistics while crossing land larger than entire European nations, all while under observation from airbases already scattered across the region. Defenders wouldn't need massive forces, just control of refueling depots, wells, and high ground observation posts. Topography turns defense into geometry. Canyons run north-south, not east-west. That alignment means each valley funnels movement while exposing flanks to fire from above. In Arizona's Mogollon Rim or Utah's Canyonlands, a dozen soldiers with rifles and range-finding equipment could deny access to thousands. Concrete walls aren't necessary when cliffs rise 1,000 feet. Helicopter insertions face downdrafts and sandstorms known locally as haboobs, walls of dust that can stretch 50 miles and cut visibility to zero. In those moments, no optics, radar, or infrared can function. Defenders trained for the weather can strike unseen, then vanish as the storm swallows everything. Water control is another silent weapon. Every city in the region, Phoenix, Las Vegas, Tucson, depends on artificial rivers, aqueducts drawn from the Colorado system. Those channels are few but vital. Destroy or contaminate one, and the dependent city reverts to sand within weeks. For an invading force hoping to occupy territory, that's catastrophic. Capture the city, lose the water, and the prize becomes useless. The defender needs only to sabotage its own infrastructure to deny sustenance. Geography gives the option of withdrawal without concession. Deserts also distort technology. Fine dust infiltrates turbine blades, optical lenses, and weapon housings. Moving parts seize within days without constant maintenance. Tanks and transports must refit filters continually, consuming spares faster than any supply chain can replenish. In a prolonged campaign, fleets of dead vehicles would litter the landscape long before decisive battles occur. Meanwhile, solar radiation fries circuits, complicating drone surveillance and satellite communications. Paradoxically, the brightest region in the country becomes the hardest to see inside. The population distribution compounds this defense. Urban centers, Tucson, Albuquerque, Las Vegas, sit like islands across thousands of square miles of sparsely inhabited terrain. Each connects by few highways. Each has local National Guard or Air Force presence within minutes. That spacing creates pockets of fortified strongholds surrounded by empty zones where invaders must expose themselves to reach the next objective. Occupying isolated cities gains little when every route between them remains hostile. Defending forces can leapfrog by air while attackers crawl by land. Then there is the border climate's unpredictability. The Sonoran Desert is famous for monsoon bursts that drop inches of rain in minutes. Dry arroyos surge into torrents that erase vehicles. Mud hardens again within an hour, trapping machinery in dried cement. The same route that looked passable in the morning becomes impassable by afternoon. Navigation satellites might provide coordinates, but what they can't show is whether the path exists anymore. In conflict, that uncertainty destroys schedules, the very rhythm modern warfare requires. Night doesn't relieve the strain. Temperature plunges 40 degrees once the sun sets. Metal contracts, engines misfire, and condensation introduces corrosion overnight. Even resting troops battle hypothermia despite being in a desert. The cycle repeats daily, chewing through endurance faster than any skirmish. Occupation here isn't a tactical problem, it's a physiological one. Human bodies weren't designed for such swings. For defenders, air dominance multiplies the hardship. Vast open basins make radar coverage simple. Stealth has nowhere to hide. Airfields in Southern California, Nevada, and Western Texas can scramble sorties covering the entire region within minutes. Missiles launched from well within the continent can reach the borders long before any invading aircraft could refuel. Geography again assists technology. An enemy on the ground would always operate under a hostile sky, every movement visible, every supply conv, tracked by sensors unimpeded by foliage or mountains. Even hypothetical advances from the Pacific side fail the same way. Between the coastal range of California and the deserts east of it lie more passes that act as funnels: Cajon, Tehachapi, and the Imperial Valley. Each is narrow, densely built, and easily choked. The contrast between lush coastal basins and the scorched interior means any invading force landing on beaches quickly confronts the same dry emptiness inland. California may seem open, but its lifelines, water pipelines, interstate highways, and mountain passes, run through zones easily defended by handfuls of troops or precision strikes. The Southwest, in effect, extends its gauntlet right to the ocean's edge. Historically, armies that ventured into similar conditions elsewhere found retreat the only form of survival. From Napoleon's divisions in Egypt to modern interventions in desert regions, supply failure has always preceded defeat. The American Southwest shares that same arithmetic on a continental scale. It offers nothing freely, no water, no shade, no easy retreat. For those native to it, that austerity builds resilience. For outsiders, it builds attrition. The irony is clear. Of all America's terrains, this one looks simplest on a map, wide sand basins under endless blue. Yet it might be the most punishing. Every degree of heat, every mile of bare road, every canyon carved by wind layers, another obstacle onto invaders already exhausted by oceans, rivers, mountains, and plains. The Southwest doesn't need fortifications. Its topography itself is an arsenal. And beyond these deserts, as map lines bend north again toward cold horizons, geography sharpens one final edge. The borderlands of Alaska and the Arctic stretch into positions that seem remote until war makes them critical. Up there, invasion meets its ultimate adversary, not heat this time, but a wall of ice, distance, and darkness. The Arctic and northern frontier. At the roof of the continent, where the Rocky Mountains taper into frozen ridges, America's final barrier stretches into the sky. The Arctic frontier isn't static land. It's a living maze of ice, mountains, and storm systems that shift faster than any logistics map can track. Here, geography doesn't merely resist invasion, it erases intent. Before a hostile force even touches the mainland, nature exhausts it through cold, distance, and silence. The northern approach to the United States runs through Alaska, a land so vast that geography itself feels abstract. Alaska covers more area than the next three largest U.S. states combined, yet holds fewer than 1 million people. Its coastlines spill into the Bering, Chukchi, and Beaufort Seas, each locked under ice most of the year. Between the Russian mainland and Alaska's western coast lies the Bering Strait, just 55 miles wide at its narrowest, yet so hostile that even modern icebreakers tiptoe across. Temperatures can plunge below -60 Fahrenheit, with drifting pack ice forming ridges that can trap or crush vessels in minutes. These aren't waters that welcome fleets, they consume them. In theory, this strait looks like a short bridge between Asia and North America, the narrowest possible invasion route. But that apparent weakness is an illusion. The strait functions as a natural moat of shifting ice flows, violent currents, and minimal daylight. For half the year, the sun barely rises, turning navigation into guesswork. The other half, endless daylight blinds sensors and human eyes alike with glare. Any coordinated crossing, by sea or air, would collapse under the elements before meeting opposition. Even if an invading force managed a lodgment on Alaska's western shore, it would encounter immediate paralysis. There are no major roads linking that coast to the rest of the continent. The Dalton Highway, one of the few routes beyond Fairbanks, threads more than 400 miles through permafrost, avalanche zones, and steep grades before reaching the Arctic Ocean. It's a single gravel ribbon vulnerable to collapse each thaw season. Destroy a bridge, trigger a landslide, or even let a storm pass, and the line vanishes. Supplying forces beyond it becomes impossible. Airlift support fares little better, wind shear along the Brooks Range tears apart flight plans, and refueling depots lie hundreds of miles apart. The land behind those coasts isn't empty, it's a bottleneck of impossible terrain. The Brooks Range stretches across northern Alaska like a frozen cousin of the Rockies, capped in glaciers that never fully melt. Valleys remain swampy in summer, frozen in winter, and impassable both ways. Vehicles sink in mud or ice depending on the month. Timberline stays so low that building shelter or concealment from aircraft is nearly impossible. What looks like open tundra on a map is in reality a shifting patchwork of bogs that devour everything heavier than a snowshoe. Historically, militaries discovered this constraint early. During World War II, the US built a defensive chain through the Aleutian Islands to counter potential Japanese movement. Even equipped with wartime industrial resources and months of planning, American forces lost as much equipment to weather as to enemy fire. The Aleutians taught a permanent lesson. Here, logistics determine victory long before combat begins. At Adak and Attu, ships faced seas that changed from calm to 30-foot waves within an hour. Engineers struggled just to pour concrete because freeze-thaw cycles shattered foundations overnight. Those same physical realities still govern the region 80 years later. Modern technology hasn't eliminated the barrier, it simply quantified it. Satellite imagery reveals that much of northern Alaska sits atop discontinuous permafrost, soil that melts irregularly, causing the ground itself to heave and crack. Runways buckle, antennas tilt, buried cables rise out of the earth. For an invader hoping to construct forward bases, that instability nullifies effort. Even temporary camps require insulation layers and constant maintenance. Every logistic ton of supplies demands escort and heating, multiplying fuel consumption in a place where distance alone already triples it. Climate presents alternating obstacles. Summers transform tundra into marsh, dotted with lakes and swarms of insects so dense they cripple visibility. The brief warm season actually worsens mobility. Tracked vehicles churn deep grooves that fill with meltwater, trapping subsequent convoys. By October, ground hardens again, but darkness prevails for months. Average daylight near the Arctic Circle falls to a few midday hours. Navigation relies entirely on instruments subject to magnetic drift near the pole. Radios crackle with interference caused by auroras. The same atmospheric beauty tourists admire also scrambles communications and radar. Across the polar region, storms are unlike those at lower latitudes. Blizzards arrive horizontally, carrying granular snow that exploits every gap in machinery and clothing. Visibility falls to arm's length. At sea, ice accumulates on hulls until ships capsize under their own armor of frost. Aircraft engines require constant de-icing, burning precious fuel. Defenders accustomed to the cycle can shelter and wait. Attackers can do neither. The Arctic doesn't forgive delay or error. It measures survival by preparation, not strength. Strategically, Alaska functions as both an early warning station and natural rampart. The chain of radar installations stretching across the Arctic, known since the Cold War as the North Warning System, already turns geography into detection. From these ridgelines, defenders see everything coming from the Pole or Pacific. The state's military facilities, Elmendorf-Richardson near Anchorage, Eielson near Fairbanks, Clear Sands Missile Field near Denali, sit behind hundreds of miles of wilderness. Any attempt to strike them by land means fighting across terrain where there are no roads, towns, or cover. Fighters and interceptors can launch from secure bases far behind the line, enjoying home field logistics while invaders exhaust themselves just reaching visibility. Even hypothetical amphibious assaults from the Arctic side crumble under navigation. The Northwest Passage, a shortcut through Canada's archipelago long dreamed of by explorers, remains clogged with unpredictable ice. Despite warming trends, its channels vary yearly, with new bourgs forming from collapsing glaciers. Large fleets cannot rely on open transit. The timing window for passage can shrink to mere weeks, trapping vessels if misjudged. For defenders, this means static choke points. For attackers, an obstacle course spanning 1,000 miles of frozen labyrinth. Further east, the Great Lakes cold mirror extends that northern shield deeper into the continent. Winter locks all inland shipping as far south as Chicago and Detroit. Ice forms natural barricades around harbors, granting months of impassable frontier. Even conflicts fought by modern navies would yield to this simple physics of freezing. An army might invade Canada's southern corridors, but crossing the frozen lakes en masse is fantasy. Wind stress cracks the ice unpredictably, while spring thaws swallow men and machines alike. Nature decides when movement is possible, and its schedule never aligns with military plans. The cultural geography compounds defense. Northern communities, from Nome to Barrow, operate under conditions that outsiders can barely imagine. Local pilots fly in zero visibility, using landmarks buried under snow. Hunters cross ice by instinct for thickness unknown to satellite data. That indigenous and frontier knowledge translates directly into asymmetric advantage. An occupying army would have no access to that intuition, relying on maps that change monthly. Defenders, living in coordination with land and season, would dictate engagement on their own terms. From a broader continental view, the Arctic Ring completes America's grand topographical fortress. Oceans guard the east and west, deserts the south, and ice the north. This frozen crown prevents surprise and guarantees time. Any foreign power mobilizing through those polar approaches would do so years in advance, its logistics glaringly visible to satellites long before reaching the Alaskan coast. Between radar, weather, and geography, stealth ceases to exist. The paradox once again lies in appearance. Maps show proximity between Siberia and Alaska, implying vulnerability. Reality shows the opposite, closeness without accessibility. The two continents nearly touch, yet across that narrow strip sprawls a chasm of wind, ice, and ungovernable cold. It's a frontier that functions less like a border and more like a climate weapon, one permanently aligned to defend the land behind it. From the Arctic southward, every invader would find themselves funneled into harsher corridors, either the Rockies, the northern plains, or the Great Lakes, each exacting its own toll. Geography ensures that nothing reaches the American heartland unbroken. Up here, at the top of the world, the first and final line of defense is written in frost and distance. The fortress ends where the earth curves away, where even ambition freezes solid before finding purchase. The interior fortress, rivers, resources, and scale. By now, any invading army that has defied oceans, mountains, deserts, and ice would arrive deep within the continental interior, a place they might think finally lacks obstacles. But this perception diverges sharply from reality. The North American heartland isn't undefended. It's organized by nature itself into a fortress so integrated with human settlement that logistics, geography, and industry fuse into one seamless defense network. Here, rivers serve as highways for defenders, resources ensure endless supply, and scale alone guarantees exhaustion for the intruder. First, consider the sheer size. The continental United States spans nearly 3,000 miles east to west and 1,500 miles north to south. That's a defensive depth larger than all of Western Europe combined. Within that space lie hundreds of interconnected urban centers, each with independent power generation, food networks, and transportation links. An invader might seize a city, but behind it stand dozens more, each capable of producing fuel, ammunition, and vehicles. Seizing one node in such a network achieves nothing when the network itself extends across a continent. At the center of this system lie rivers, thousands of navigable miles linking one region's strength to another's resilience. The Mississippi, Ohio, and Missouri systems merge like arteries feeding an industrial body. Barges can carry hundreds of tons of cargo per trip, for a fraction of the fuel trucks would burn overland. Even during crises, these waterways remain active under Army Corps of Engineers oversight, allowing rapid redeployment of resources from distant states. For defense, that means near-limitless capacity to reposition supplies without reliance on vulnerable highways. Any invader lacking control over these channels fights, while surrounded by supply routes permanently favoring the local side. The river network also creates boundaries that break invading formations. Rather than open plains, the heartland is carved by tributaries and floodplains forming natural segments of defense. Each branch, the Illinois, Arkansas, Red, and Tennessee rivers, acts as a moat around sectors of land roughly the size of entire nations. Defensive lines can shift fluidly from one basin to the next, forcing intruders to cross water barriers repeatedly. Every crossing demands bridges, pontoons, or airlifts, all major bottlenecks ripe for precise strikes. Geography dictates attrition long before armies meet in open battle. Beyond logistics, there's the question of sustenance. Few countries on Earth match America's internal capacity for food and fuel. The same soil that turned the mid-continent into the world's breadbasket doubles as a self-replenishing storehouse for defense. Wheat from Kansas, corn from Iowa, soy from Illinois, millions of tons of caloric and industrial potential rest within hours of major transport corridors. Even disrupted rail lines or highways can't starve regions that already overproduce essentials. An occupation force, however, would depend entirely on imports ferried across thousands of perilous miles of sea. Geography transforms supply asymmetry into inevitability. The defender can lose battles and stay nourished. The invader wins skirmishes and still starves. Energy repeats this pattern. The U.S. interior contains immense deposits of oil, gas, and coal layered from the Permian Basin to the Bakken Shale. Pipelines interlace them east and west, supported by refineries deep inland, unreachable from coasts. Every refinery doubles as an autonomous fortress of energy, the resource no invader can substitute. Even partial occupation grants the defender overwhelming control of fuel, ensuring aircraft, trucks, and generators keep running indefinitely. The attacker confronts a paradox. Advancing deeper only increases exposure to the infrastructure that strengthens resistance. Compare this geographic coherence to regions historically conquered. Europe's farms exist alongside dense political borders, each disruption toppling supply for miles. In contrast, North America's interior has continuous farmland with no foreign borders to sever lines. From the Dakotas to Louisiana, fields form one connected logistical plane. Even if bridges fall and rails twist, air transport from countless public and private airstrips sustains operations. Defensive continuity, not offensive brilliance, wins wars of endurance. Then there's manufacturing geography. The industrial belt anchored by cities like Chicago, St. Louis, Detroit, and Minneapolis forms a closed loop with river and rail access to both oceans. These hubs aren't relics, they're still interwoven with energy grids and highways. During crisis, factories can pivot from civilian production to defense manufacturing, as happened during the 20th century's total wars. And unlike concentrated industrial nations vulnerable to single strikes, America's facilities are dispersed over thousands of square miles. Bombing one cluster achieves little when dozens more sustain output elsewhere. Geography multiplies redundancy. Infrastructure adds invisible armor. Interstate highways crisscross states in overlapping grids, enabling lateral movement on a scale unmatched globally. The Eisenhower interstate system was designed partly with defense in mind, to allow rapid mobilization coast to coast. Nearly every corridor parallels a rail or river route, offering backups if one is damaged. For an invading army, this web becomes a nightmare. Each section destroyed is replaced by alternate routes defenders already know intimately. And since the network lies entirely within national borders, resupply never risks foreign interference. Strategic autonomy is physical, not just political. Communications follow similar contours. Fiber optic lines and data centers spread through interior states rather than clustering on vulnerable coasts. Even large-scale disruption of satellites or outer infrastructure wouldn't sever domestic command. Geography ensures redundancy by distance alone, cables and power grids looping far inland, protected by the nation's own immensity. The attacker's problem isn't just fighting soldiers. It's competing against a system that regenerates faster than destruction can be applied. Natural resources compound this advantage. Within the same territory exist every major strategic mineral: iron ore along Lake Superior, copper in Arizona, uranium in the Rockies, rare earths in Wyoming, and timber across northern forests. No single strike deprives the defender of vital material. Historically, conquerors sought compact regions rich in singular resources. America's geology distributes wealth so widely that occupation needs total dominance across multiple climate zones, impossible given distance and terrain. Every resource lies guarded by thousands of residents and hundreds of miles of buffer space. Population density plays a subtler defensive role. Instead of clustering around one capital, Americans live distributed through mid-sized cities and towns. This decentralization complicates control. Even after losing major hubs, civic and military leadership can operate from elsewhere without diminishing national coordination. For an invader trying to impose authority, it becomes like attempting to govern a continent of independent strongholds, each supported by its local food, energy, and community ties. Geography breeds resilience through dispersion. Scale magnifies all these traits. Suppose an invading force secured half the landmass, a fantasy, but in doing so stretched its logistics across 5 million square miles. That's equivalent to holding every inch of Western Europe with one continuous front line. Each additional mile multiplies vulnerability, fuel convoys double travel, communication delay expands, air coverage thins. Defenders fighting on interior lines can rotate units rapidly, exploiting rail and river corridors that shorten distance for them while lengthening it for the enemy. Strategic theory calls this defense in depth, but here it's not doctrine, it's geography's default setting. Psychologically, the Invaders campaign erodes under scale fatigue. Occupying endless open country offers no sense of progress, just monotony and attrition. Unlike island campaigns where conquering terrain provides closure, each victory here exposes 1,000 new miles of resistance ahead. The human mind measures success by boundaries. America's geography denies that closure entirely. For defenders, the same expanse feels liberating. Retreat equals space gained, regrouping equals time bought. Consider also that every direction from the center leads to another barrier. Attempt to move east, and the Appalachians block you. West, the Rockies rise. North, the Great Lakes freeze transit. South, deserts reassert heat. The Heartland becomes an enclosed citadel whose exits each exact their own toll. To occupy it means holding ground that cannot project power outward and cannot be sustained inward without enormous investment. Eventually, scale transforms from asset to enemy for the attacker. Waterways complete this interior fortress by uniting, not dividing. From the Missouri out to the Ohio, fleets of barges can move units silently, unseen by satellites under night cover, delivering supplies faster than any land convoy. During floods, those same rivers swell into defensive moats that no tank can ford. Geography gives defenders variable terrain, sometimes highway, sometimes wall, depending on season, and only they know its timing. When mapped together, rivers for movement, resources for energy, scale for depth, the continental United States reveals an architecture of defense more profound than any man-made system. There's no single fortress to breach, because the fortress is everywhere. Cities, farms, and factories each form bricks in a defense too distributed to collapse and too self-sustaining to starve. Invaders would find themselves living inside their own containment, outnumbered by logistics, outlasted by geography. Beyond all previous natural barriers, the oceans, the mountains, the plains, the deserts, this heartland represents synergy itself, the place where natural and human systems intertwine until they're inseparable. Every river doubles as highway and shield, every resource as supply and deterrent, every square mile as another reason why victory against nature's architecture is impossible. The deeper you go, the stronger the land becomes. At the edge of comprehension, a final truth emerges. America doesn't merely possess defenses, it is one. Its rivers flow through the bones of supply, its soil fuels the machinery of endurance, its size converts distance into safeguard. This is the interior fortress, hidden in plain sight, proving that any invader surviving so far would not conquer a nation, they'd simply vanish inside its geography's endless capacity to absorb. The hidden system, geography, as the ultimate defense plan. By now the pattern is clear. Every obstacle across the United States doesn't just hinder invasion, it connects into a cohesive, continental system of protection. This isn't coincidence. It's a natural design stitched together across millions of years that functions almost like an evolved defense network. The oceans, mountains, rivers, deserts, and plains don't operate separately, they reinforce one another. The result is a nation whose security isn't primarily engineered by policy or weaponry, but embedded into the terrain itself. Geography wrote the first and final defense plan. Start at the perimeter. Two oceans form moats so wide that even the most advanced navies can't cross them without revealing their intent months in advance. The Atlantic and Pacific are not barriers in isolation. They feed into a sensor grid of geography itself, time zones of early warning. Incoming fleets must endure storms, distance, and exposure long before a single American aircraft launches. The natural span of water buys time, and time is defense. Push inland, and those protective layers overlap like nested shields. Once past the coasts, invaders find the Appalachian Mountains serving as the eastern wall. Behind them lies the Mississippi Basin, an internal moat dividing the country into hemispheres of resistance. The Rockies follow like another wall, thicker and steeper, splitting what's left of an advancing army into disconnected parts. Beyond them stretch the deserts and high plateaus of the west, where heat and scarcity finish what rivers and ridges began. Each layer diminishes momentum. Each transition requires new logistics, new technology, and new morale that an enemy can't sustain. This cascading structure forms what geographers call defense in geography depth. Unlike the military doctrine of defense in depth, where multiple human fortifications stand in sequence, this is natural redundancy, a continuous unfolding of terrain that multiplies obstacles rather than aligning them. The genius of this pattern is that it operates without coordination. An enemy slowed by mountains meets exhaustion in plains, then immobility in deserts and confusion in rivers. No single theater grants reprieve, because each barrier blends seamlessly into another. Even the climate obeys this structure. The jet streams and storm belts that sweep across the nation mirror its geography. In winter, Arctic fronts descend from the north, freezing potential northern approaches. In summer, hurricanes guard the Gulf and Atlantic. The same atmospheric systems that feed agriculture also patrol the borders. Aviation planners know this, where the windows narrow precisely when large operations would need them widest. Nature regulates campaign calendars in ways no army can schedule around. Internally, geography amplifies resilience. The Mississippi River system acts like a skeleton of mobility, allowing defenders to shift material faster than any attacker moving overland. The Great Lakes provide freshwater highways to industrial centers that regenerate material faster than it can be destroyed. The Rockies store minerals, fuel, and water that sustain the western network of cities, while the plains supply the food surplus of an empire. Every ecological zone supports the others. Destroy part of it, and the remainder compensates automatically. That's not infrastructure, it's symbiosis. Compare this to historically vulnerable regions. In Europe, nations depend on neighbors for trade and defense, linked by narrow corridors where wars often escalate instantly. In contrast, America's features distribute pressure. A storm on one coast barely touches the other. A blockade in the Gulf doesn't starve the Midwest. Rail, river, and interstate systems run perpendicular to its barriers, knitting the vast geography into self-sufficiency. This redundancy means no single strike unravels the whole. Geography itself decentralizes risk. Strategists sometimes describe security as a combination of space, time, and force. America's landmass maximizes the first, its natural obstacles lengthen the second, and its internal resources multiply the third. Every meter an invader moves west from the coast reverses these advantages. Their lines stretch, their resupply shortens, and the very distance they hope to conquer becomes quicksand. Historical precedent confirms this. Great continental powers, Russia, China, the U.S., survive invasions not by technology alone, but by elasticity. Their land absorbs pressure until invaders exhaust themselves. The unspoken brilliance behind this geography is its unity. Most continents are diffuse, deserts far from coasts, rivers misaligned with mountains, fertile zones exposed to borders. North America is different. Its defensive elements interlock. Rivers flow toward coasts, mountains frame interior basins, deserts guard highlands, and surrounding waters loop the system shut. There's no convenient axis for attack, no natural corridor stretching deep inland without obstruction. Each attempted route, Atlantic seaboard, Caribbean, Arctic, Pacific, leads into terrain tuned to punish movement. Even technology hasn't outpaced this arrangement. Aircraft compress distances but rely on predictable refueling arcs. Missiles cross continents but originate from launch points thousands of miles away, easily detected by global monitors. Geography still governs physics, fuel capacity, visibility, and weather. The same barriers that stopped armies now challenge logistics in digital form, submarine cables dodging trenches, satellites contending with polar storms. Physical geography underlies cyberspace logistics in ways few realize. Consider also the psychological geography of scale. For a nation, vastness translates into confidence, the awareness that there are layers between vulnerability and oblivion. For an invader, that same vastness breeds fatigue. Each victory looks smaller against a map that never seems to end. Morale breaks not from defeat, but from infinite distance. That's why this natural design transcends military theory. It shapes behavior. Wars aren't merely fought on land, they're fought against land. You trace these defenses on a relief map, a hidden architecture emerges. The two oceans form the outer ring. The Appalachians, Mississippi, Rockies, and Great Basin form the middle ramparts. The interior rivers, plains, and Great Lakes form the living core. It's a structure indistinguishable from a fortress viewed from above. Walls, moats, courtyard, keep. None of it planned, all of it functioning. Every possible invasion route transforms into a siege line where nature itself holds the advantage. History proves this alignment isn't theoretical. Every external incursion into North America, from colonial wars to coastal attacks, either failed or devolved into attrition precisely because of geography. Even internal wars respected these contours, campaigns bent around rivers and ranges rather than through them. The Civil War's outcome, the westward expansion's pace, and the industrial heartland's placement all mirror topography's hidden guidance. Geography didn't just defend, it dictated development. In a world where military technology evolves hourly, this permanence is astonishing. Missiles, drones, and cyber tools can be redesigned, mountains and rivers cannot. Those immovable features remain constant reference points shaping doctrine. Modern defense planners still plot radar stations along continental divides because ridges amplify range. Naval yards still cluster where natural harbors carved shelter. Energy reserves still follow sediment basins formed hundreds of millions of years ago. The present sits grafted onto the prehistoric, and in that graft lies durability. Term homeland security often evokes surveillance systems or missile shields, but those are temporary expressions of a far deeper constant. The real shield is geological and meteorological. It transcends administrations and alliances. While other nations depend on foreign partners to buffer threats, the United States carries its buffers in stone, ice, and water. That autonomy defines not just safety, but identity, a sense that peril must always travel an impossible distance to arrive. If all artificial defenses vanished tomorrow, bases, fleets, air power, the raw land would still deter conquest. To control America, a challenger would have to master 10,000 miles of coast, survive deserts of heat and cold, cross mountain walls twice, bridge rivers wider than cities, and occupy plains vast enough to dwarf Europe. Every step adds complexity faster than conquest can compensate. Geography scales difficulty exponentially, turning ambition into folly. And so the hidden system isn't a design of generals, but of geology, a planetary coincidence aligning plate tectonics, erosion, and river flow into a structure that mimics human strategy. It is the quiet intelligence of the continent itself, a network of barriers and arteries that make invasion not unlikely, but technically irrational. Nations may rise and fall, technologies may sharpen, but the map remains the original strategist, older and wiser than any of its inhabitants. In the end, America's greatest military doctrine is carved, not written. The ridges, valleys, and waterways compose the unspoken alliance between earth and nation. Long before borders were drawn, the land was already defending its own contours. The true arsenal of the United States isn't steel or circuitry, it's geological violence, patient and unrelenting, a continental will that stands watch in silence. And if history ever challenges it again, those same contours will answer as they always have, with distance, depth, and consequence. Resolution and broader meaning. America's real armor isn't its missiles or fleets, it's the land itself. From ocean edge to mountain crest, from frozen north to burning deserts, every feature stacks into a single, continuous defense instinct. The Mississippi divides supply, the Rockies deny passage, and the Great Lakes guard the heart. Each barrier alone is formidable. Together, they form a geography that cannot be occupied for long. Invading the United States isn't merely difficult, it's strategically irrational. What makes this truth remarkable is that it predates the country. Long before towns, trains, or treaties, the continent already carried its defensive blueprint in stone and riverbeds. Every generation of settlers, soldiers, and engineers only built along contours nature had already drawn. That partnership of terrain and civilization became something rare in history, a nation whose endurance depends not on empire abroad, but on stability within its borders. Geography shaped power here by granting distance, resources, and cohesion unmatched anywhere else on Earth. It explains not only why foreign armies never landed successfully, but also why the idea of invasion itself faded into impossibility. If you want to understand how other nations' terrain shapes their fate, their barriers, weaknesses, and hidden strengths, watch this next. Subscribe for more stories where maps speak louder than history and where the ground beneath our feet decides how civilizations survive. Because sometimes the greatest weapon a nation possesses isn't made by human hands, it's carved by time itself.